To what extent can a pilot withstand the pressure before making a mistake that leads to a collapse? Was it really Hülkenberg's fault, or was this entire disaster a reflection of a much more uncomfortable truth that his own engineer could no longer hide? The 2025 United States Grand Prix, held at the iconic Circuit of the Americas in Austin, Texas, had been marked in advance by fans, analysts, and the McLaren team itself as one of the most decisive weekends of the entire season. Oscar Piastri arrived as the leader of the championship, 22 points ahead of his teammate Lando Norris, in the midst of a climate of euphoria that reminded us of the golden years of the Papaya team. The atmosphere was one of imminent victory, as if the outcome of a long journey of redemption that had begun years before, from the darkness of the last positions on the grid to the pinnacle of technical performance, was finally taking shape. The car was competitive, the strategic management had been fine-tuned to the millimeter, and the pressure of the championship was palpable on every face in the Woking pit. But Formula One has a unique way of destabilizing even the most meticulously constructed plans. Saturday's sprint race was a stark reminder that in this sport, a single moment of chaos can completely change the course of a season. As soon as the traffic lights went out, Piastri made an aggressive start, placing himself on a trajectory that sought the famous switchback in Turn 1, a risky maneuver where the driver cuts on the inside just after the rival has defended on the outside. Austin's Turn 1, with its enormous positive slope and funnel design, invites these decisions. But it is also a death trap for those who underestimate space, braking, and tire temperature on the first turn of a race. Piastri, focused solely on gaining position from Norris, did not notice or did not want to notice the presence of Nico Hülkenberg's Sauber, which was pressed between him and Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin. That car compression was lethal. The Sauber's front tire impacted the rear axle of Piastri's McLaren, which destabilized it to the point of sending it uncontrollably directly into the side of Norris' car. Both Papaya cars were eliminated in a matter of seconds. The contact was so violent that the first lap was not even completed. In the paddock, the silence was immediate, interrupted only by the resounding reaction of McLaren CEO Zak Brown. From the pit wall, Brown was interviewed by Sky Sports and made very harsh statements. He accused Hülkenberg of having acted like a rookie, of not respecting the minimum race space, and of having unnecessarily ruined the internal duel between Piastri and Norris. His frustration was understandable. It was not a simple accident, but a double retirement that left the team without points in a weekend where Red Bull, with Verstappen in charge, took full advantage to close the gap in the fight for the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. That combination of sporting tragedy and opportunity for rivals turned the incident into a turning point. But what at that time was seen as an unjustified attack from outside the team would soon reveal a much more complex and painful truth from within. What seemed like a misfortune caused by third parties, in reality hid a chain of hasty decisions, lack of communication on the track, and above all, a delicate emotional state that Piastri's own engineer would later confess. In that first minute of the sprint race, not only did two McLaren cars collide. The image of an invulnerable team and the perception that Oscar Piastri was a perfectly balanced driver also collapsed symbolically. What happened in Austin was not simply a crash. It was the visible symptom of a pressure that was already wearing down those who were trying to sustain McLaren's dream from within. And with that blow, the championship, the narrative of the year, and the internal relationships within the team took a turn that no one in Woking could have anticipated. Sometimes the fight for glory has a price, and that Saturday in Texas, McLaren began to pay it with interest. The hours after the accident in Austin were not simply technical analysis. What occurred behind the walls of McLaren's garage was an exercise in forced introspection. Every piece of data, every onboard, every piece of telemetry, and every camera angle was reviewed over and over again. The objective was not only to understand what had happened, but also to save what could be rescued from the story. Because when you're fighting for a world championship, narrative is also part of the game. And in this case, the initial story that pointed blame toward a rival pilot began to unravel with alarming rapidity. The telemetry was particularly revealing. It showed that Piastri had braked late, turned more than usual, and did not take into account the flow of cars coming through the interior. These data coincided with what the onboard videos of Hülkenberg's Sauber and Alonso's Aston Martin already suggested. That Oscar entered an area in which there was simply no space to execute that maneuver without contact. The intention was clear, the ambition too. But the conditions were not met. And most importantly, the moment did not justify it. It was the first lap of a sprint race in a curve where all the cars are still compacted, the brakes are cold, the tires are out of optimal range, and visibility is reduced by the spray from the cars in front. Faced with this evidence, Zak Brown had no choice but to recant. He did it in public, something that is not common in the political and controlled environment of Formula One. He acknowledged that he had been harsh in his initial judgment and that after viewing the images carefully, he could not blame Hülkenberg for what happened. This retraction was received with surprise in the paddock, but also with respect. However, what no one expected was what would come next. In an interview the following day, Oscar Piastri's race engineer Tom Stallard made a revelation that few within the team wanted made public. In the middle of an apparently technical conversation, Stallard hinted that the psychological pressure that the young Australian pilot was enduring was much more intense than what was perceived from the outside. He compared it to the 4-year Olympic cycle, in which athletes have just one shot at glory. In his words, Piastri felt as if 2025 was his only real opportunity to be crowned world champion, and that feeling, although powerful as a motivation, can become counterproductive if not managed correctly. Stallard, who is not only an engineer but also a former Olympic rowing athlete, said it with complete clarity. When an athlete believes that he has to do everything perfectly at every moment because there will be no second chance, the margin for making rational decisions is dangerously narrowed. That mentality, which in many contexts can increase performance, in a highly complex environment like Formula One, can have the opposite effect. It can lead to error, overexertion, and emotional collapse hidden under apparently bold decisions. Stallard's most disturbing line was also his most revealing. This is always slightly dangerous, because handling pressure is about doing what you're good at, not trying to do magic. That confession completely changed the reading of the incident. We were no longer facing a miscalculation on the track. We were looking at a pilot who, consumed by the weight of expectations, had crossed the line that separates control from impulsiveness. At that moment, McLaren was no longer simply a leading team with title aspirations. It became a case study in how the pressure of success, when not managed with emotional maturity, can push even the most promising talents into situations of unnecessary risk. And it wasn't just Piastri. The fact that his own engineer spoke openly about these issues indicates that the entire team was aware of the driver's emotional state, but perhaps had not taken the necessary steps to protect him from the competitive environment that they themselves had helped to build. The accident had already happened. The points were lost. But the real loss for McLaren was another, that of the illusion that its star driver could withstand any load without breaking. And that learning, although silent, can be the most costly of the entire season. The accident in Austin was more than a specific loss of points. It was a crack in the armor carefully forged by McLaren over the past 2 years. And what followed was not just an attempt to contain the immediate damage, but a silent and tense effort to prevent a larger collapse. Because when a team that has been rising with such force suffers a shakeup of this magnitude, the danger lies not only in the standings, but in what begins to crack inside. The mutual trust, the emotional stability, and the strategic balance that any team that aspires to greatness requires. Furthermore, the media environment did not help. Cross statements, constant analysis of Piastri's mistake, and the perception that the team had been too slow to take responsibility began to erode McLaren's public image as a cohesive structure. Social networks and the specialized press focused heavily on the issue, and although the reaction was divided, some defending Piastri, others pointing out the team's lack of leadership, the effect was the same. Massive exposure of an internal crisis that was previously only whispered in the corridors of the paddock. In the long term, the impact of what happened in Austin could redefine McLaren's path for the rest of the season. If they can pull themselves together, establish clear boundaries, and protect their drivers from emotional breakdown, they will have demonstrated organizational maturity on par with the great champions. But if they fail in that attempt, the fall will not be due to lack of speed or strategic errors, but rather due to a much more human element, the inability to sustain pressure when success already seems within reach. Engineer Tom Stallard not only revealed a specific concern. What he exposed is a profound truth about the mental state of a pilot who feels that he is in his unique and unrepeatable moment. That mentality is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it drives you to perform beyond your limits. But on the other hand, it can lead to desperate decisions that compromise the entire work of a team. Leave me the comments what you think about all this.